My name is Julien Kloek. I'm hosting this event today with our two distinguished speakers, Professor Balibar and Professor Bronkhorst. And all of this is made possible with the generous support of Erasmus University College, as well as the Erasmus Institute for Public Knowledge, and we are most grateful. So now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Professor Etienne Balibar, who will speak to us for approximately 45 minutes. And Etienne Balibar is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Paris-West, as well as the Anniversary Chair in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University in London, and the author of many books. I'm not going to stand here for an hour and list all of them, but just some recent translations, perhaps. As students, you are aware of Spinoza and Politics, which we read in one of our courses. So that's your previous exposure, at least. And also from 2017, the monograph Citizen Subjects, Foundations for Philosophical Anthropology. And from 2018, Secularism and Cosmopolitanism, Critical Hypotheses on Religion and Politics. And then forthcoming, actually in a few days, is the Dutch translation of the latest book on Europe by Professor Balibar, in French, L'Europe crise et fin, but in Dutch, Waarheen met Europa.
Voor een ander Europa. Sorry.
For an ander Europa. And everyone should read it. So please join me in welcoming Professor Balibar.
Thank you very much. My great pleasure and honor to be speaking here this afternoon in the company of my eminent colleague, Professor Hauke Bronkhorst. And I want first to express my deep gratitude to the Erasmus University College, to Willem Schinken, who invited me to take part yesterday in the beautiful promotion of Julien Kloek, and I want to thank Julien himself for offering us a very interesting starting point, to which probably we'll have to return in the conversation, because this is very much our subject, depoliticization applied to the European question, and for organizing this afternoon's session. Okay, first thing I want to say is I'm not speaking as an expert or a specialist. I'm trying to speak simply as a European citizen among other European citizens, and hoping to engage in a lively conversation with you all about our common public thing, as the Latin tradition would say, res communis, commune, or communis, excuse me, or publica. But of course, to be a European citizen doesn't mean that you are interchangeable with any other one. We all have our specific locations. And these locations, places where we live, places where we vote, what we are going to do very soon now, once again, and perhaps we'll return to that, places where we work, places where we interact with colleagues and also many other people, inevitably influence and to some extent determine how we perceive, I would say, this very strange thing that we have in common. In my case, I would say that, I hope this is not idle, that the two places to which I feel related and which I think are important are, of course, the national location, which is France in my case. Some of us have multiple roots or multiple belongings in this respect. I think this is also an extremely important experience. And to that, I would add the university. I mean, the university or the academia, if you prefer, in English. In French, we have a tendency to call it université in the broad sense, but you would say the academia in English. And I think this is important not only because, of course, an academic like me and others here is very profoundly shaped in his or her mindset by this specific location, but also because I believe that many things are problematic in the current European predicament, and the academia, of course, has its problems everywhere, but it's probably one of the few institutions which has achieved or is in the course of achieving a kind of, I wouldn't say supranational, but transnational mode of working and thinking. And therefore the fact of belonging to an academic environment and being or having been teaching in different universities in different parts of Europe, including in this country, in a sense, of course, that creates a kind of closure. You're not immediately communicating with people in the factories or in the flower fields, etc. But so there are limitations to that, but it also gives an opening which I think is very precious. Then I would say that I'm trying to speak as a European citizen who is very concerned, and that's of course my subject for today, by what I will tentatively describe as the critical situation of Europe, and therefore also its components and its different parts, the national parts today, and more generally, of course, the critical situation of the world, meaning the planet and the people who are either mobile or immobile and sedentary in this world. And therefore, one of the backgrounds for what I hope we are going to discuss today is, of course, the question of the role that Europe as such could and should play in that difficult world of today. And then finally, excuse me if this seems a little long, I would like to also say that inevitably, whatever I can think, imagine, and try to communicate is determined by personal history, by some previous commitments, tracing back a long time ago. Of course, I have not kept all the convictions and the commitments I had when I was young, like you. But I also haven't completely abandoned them. I'm still a socialist. I could even say that I'm a communist in some sense, you know. But I have become a federalist, which is something which I was not in the past and which will, in a sense, orientate my intervention. But finally, I also want to say that if you expect something like a program or strong statement of what we ought to do, you'll be disappointed, because, in a sense, I keep a little bit of skepticism or uncertainty about my own hypotheses. But I think that, in a sense, this is something that many great political theorists have shared. I mean, each in their own different way. I mean, this was Gramsci's pessimism of the intelligence, or this was Max Weber's form of skepticism. Okay, let me come to the central point. First question I want to raise is whether we are right to, we have the right to speak of something like a crisis of the European construction, therefore, institutionally speaking, of course, the European Union in this moment, whether we should push this idea to the extreme. There's much talk, quite different from what it used to be only a few years ago, in fact, even in official circles. of the so-called existential crisis of the European Union. And therefore, of course, inevitably, the next question is how to resolve that crisis, and of course, which procedure should we follow? You hear such words as Europe needs to be founded again, needs a new foundation, or needs to be fixed. That's not exactly the same. But the first preliminary question would probably be something like, is this new? Because we also hear, and I'm not against this idea that, in a sense, this very bizarre political construction that is post-war World War II common market and then European Union, in a sense, lives in a state of permanent crisis. There's even an idea very often presented and renewed. I read it recently once again under the pen of a well-known Dutch political philosopher who has also played an official role in the last period, Luc van Middelaar, who explains that, in fact, the normal regime of the European construction is a state of permanent crisis. But of course, this has a positive meaning only if we admit or if we suggest that behind this idea of permanent crisis, there lies, I would say, something like a dialectics, a quasi-Hegelian dialectics of the canon of history, or in other words, the idea that the crisis, through its very development, leads to resolution and therefore to transformation. Now, that is precisely the question that I want now to continue about. If we speak of crisis, and I will enumerate a few symptoms that I think are quite significant of this situation, is it really the case that such dialectics, if you like, of crisis resolution transformation is still perceivable or can be anticipated in the same manner? Now, the symptoms that I want to invoke, there are many, of course, and I'm sure others could be added to that, are essentially of two kinds. The first, I think, is an accumulation of recent examples of the incapacity of the European Union as such, that is, as a political body, to resolve its own political problems, and not only to resolve them, but even to express them, to openly discuss them. This is a symptom that certainly already has to do with what Julien Klug in his dissertation perfectly calls or expresses as a phenomenon of depoliticization. But when there are political problems which cannot be expressed as such, and therefore a broad effect of depoliticization, then of course the very idea of resolution becomes extremely problematic. I would mention first, for me this is very important, the way in which the Greek debt and economic crisis was handled. I follow completely Yanis Varoufakis in his description of what took place, and particularly the role that the Eurogroup and its Dutch president, the Minister of Finance at the time, played in organizing this kind of handling that is a secret discussion of the real issues and the forms in which the alternative between expelling Greece from the Eurozone and therefore, of course, marginalizing it in the European Union, or keeping it but under conditions which, in fact, under our very eyes, are leading to a state of economic destruction and catastrophe currently in the country were handled. I find this all the more important to mention because more recently, of course, we have another problem in Europe that seems to have some affinities or analogies with the Greek problem, which is the problem of the Italian economic situation. And on this occasion, the very president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said something that I find unbelievable and, in a sense, almost obscene. Beg your pardon for using very violent words. He said, we're not going to, I quote literally, we're not going to repeat with Italy the mistake we made when handling the Greek case, which is a very strange way of admitting that a mistake had been made, something that had never been admitted. Okay. Then there's a second example, different, although they are overlapping to some extent, which is the treatment of the crisis of asylum for refugees and migrants. I very much admire Angela Merkel's initiative in 2015, and if we have time, perhaps we return to that. But the fact is that this initiative was killed, let's put it like that, by other European governments, including governments which claim to be very sympathetic and have solidarity with the German initiative, which led in turn to, of course, a reversal or partial reversal of the public opinion in Germany on the same question. And I skip intermediaries. The result today, something very strange, is first the re-emergence of internal borders in Europe, which are increasingly, of course, fortified and guarded in order to prevent migrants and refugees to travel inside this supposedly open and free space. And of course, there's a tragic situation in the Mediterranean that Europe turns a blind eye to. Then there are constitutional problems in several countries of Europe. And here again, I have to be quick because time is passing and never get to the end, but this is not important. This is inevitable, let's put it like that. And here I'm thinking of the, they're not twin cases, of course, but the two different cases of Poland on one side, its constitutional or juridical transformations. Europe is addressing this issue to some extent, I have to acknowledge, and I find it very important, of course, but there's here a blatant contradiction between what one country is doing internally and the very principles that the European Union has proclaimed and which every member state is supposed to follow. And on the other side, there's the Spanish case, the way in which the question of Catalan independence was handled, where I firmly believe that Europe had something to say, if only to make sure that not to decide what in the end should be the solution, but to make sure that the problem would be handled in a precisely democratic and juridically right way. And this is not finished because we have a trial in this very moment. And then I could continue, and I have to skip Brexit, to which we will perhaps return, but my firm conviction is that, and I offer it for discussion, of course, that the situation with Brexit is not that there are crazy Brits on one side who are doing permanently the wrong thing and prove totally unable to find a solution. Of course, this is extremely interesting and revealing. I will try to return to that in a minute if I have time, of the fact that European Union is a very complex system from which you cannot really get out, I mean, in a sense. And but on the other hand, of course, the European Union is also revealing some of its internal contradictions and weaknesses in this situation. Finally, what I want to propose as an important symptom of the crisis, and that takes us back to, in particular, to the question of the refugee and migrant crisis, is the fact that the more I think about it, and again, take this just as a personal hypothesis, which I hope is not entirely subjective, the more I believe that we should not consider as totally separated problems the fact that on one side, everybody agrees more or less on that, there's a growing anti-European, or in other terms, nationalist push or tendency. There are growing nationalist feelings in almost every part of Europe. So they are expressed through political movements, parties, AfD in Germany, right-wing and left-wing sometimes parties or movements in France, which I perceive as extremely contradictory in their content and objectives, because the external, the appearance, is a rejection of supranationality, limitations on national sovereignties, excesses of power, etc., of the European Commission, which is even sometimes compared to the kind of authoritarian, even dictatorial system that existed, for example, in the Soviet Union and satellite countries, etc. Whereas simultaneously, of course, there's also very clearly a strong demand directed to the European Union as such to do the right thing, and particularly to change some of its basic economic and social orientations. But the point I want to make is that if you take this nationalist development on one side, and the question of refugees and migrants on the other side, which apparently are connected only by the fact that many of the nationalists are strongly anti-xenophobic and anti-migrants and against the idea of taking refugees, which practically, of course, is not such a big problem. So I believe that this treatment of the question of refugees produces something like a moral delegitimation of the European system as such. And I don't believe that any political body, be it a nation state or be it an empire or anyway, can really subsist and continue and win, I would say, the acceptation and the dedication of its own citizens if it's progressively delegitimated, morally speaking. Okay, so we'd have here to, I'll have to skip some parts, to now, of course, try and say something about the causes of this critical situation, of which I mentioned only a few aspects. And this is indeed a very complicated question where most of us have divergent views about. I think that we cannot say, and here I'm on a different line, even with respect to some of my friends. I said I spoke as a socialist or even as an old communist, not to say Marxist. I know this old-fashioned name, etc. So I don't believe that the cause lie in the original constitution of the European system as we know it, as it was constructed after World War II, because that was a creation of the Cold War and so on. I believe that the main causes lie in the form in which, after 1989, that is the end of the Cold War precisely, this original constitution, which had already received many inflections and transformations and had been relatively open to several possible evolutions, has been reinterpreted to install what I would call the financial logic, meaning extreme commodification of public services and others services, deregulation of complete as possible, deregulation of markets, and devaluation of labor as a social force in the very core of of the states themselves. And because, of course, these states, both in the West and in the East, used to define themselves as social states. In my somewhat perilous terminology, I say sometimes national or national social states, because they were social states, but within the national borders. This has extremely destructive and devastating effects on the very consistency and unity of the nations themselves. This is neoliberalism proper. Then there is, of course, in what I would call in Habermasian terms, the burying of the question of the post-national constellation and of the respective functions of nations and federations of federal level in the European constructions. The national question, and I wouldn't have said that like that some years ago, but I became increasingly aware of that. Perhaps you could say it's the effect, the positive effect in a sense, of the populist movements in Europe recently. You can't just say either that you add a federal system of institutions, or that you move from a situation of alleged, at least full national sovereignty, to a situation in which sovereignty is shared among different countries and therefore takes a federal or quasi-federal form. If you do not address the question, what does the nation become? What to make with the nations? They are not pure and simply vanishing or progressively withering away because they would belong to a past. They need to receive a new function, and therefore their very meaning needs to be reinterpreted. And this is, of course, something that the European Union always carefully puts under the table and doesn't want to explicitly discuss. In both cases, the neoliberal tendencies and the burying of the national question, the integration of Eastern Europe, of course, has played an important role. Then, of course, I would have to say something, but I skip it, on something very well known, which is the articulation of the financial system around the common currency and the growing social inequalities in Europe. But I would want to end the question of causes with the idea that there's increasingly a gap between Europe's concept of the post-socialist or liberal economy and the actual tendencies of globalization in today's world. We're supposed to build something which is fit to place Europe, I would say, in the new universal liberal economic system. The global economy is not evolving in that direction. It's evolving in the direction increasingly of neo-mercantilist policies that we can observe either on the American side or very clearly on the Chinese side. And it's, of course, heading towards something partially enigmatic, but which certainly will be very harsh and perhaps violent, which is the contest for the hegemony in the world of today between the declining power of North America and the rising power of China. And Europe is, in a sense, taken aback by this situation. Okay, so I will, and I think that's part of the current malaise. So I will skip considerations on the consequences. In fact, I already alluded. I just want to add one word on this concerning the issue of the possible resolution of the crisis, if there is one. And the title of my French collection of essays was mentioned a moment ago. Thank you for this generous reference. in French, not in Dutch. It is called Europe, crise ou fin, question mark. In some English version, it has been, of one of the texts, it has become something like final crisis with a question mark. And here I want to say, because I really think that we should not overstate our point, that the meaning of that relative or current impossibility to find a solution remains extremely enigmatic. In some previous papers I borrowed, and I'm not the only one, I mean, this has been made by several contributors to the debate, the famous expression that you find in Gramsci's prison notebooks, the idea of the interregnum. Europe finds itself in an interregnum, which Gramsci defined as a moment in which the past institutions no longer work and the future of the new institutions are not yet there. They're not even conceived as such, which creates, he says, very pathological situation in which all sorts of contradictions and violent effects can arise. Now, the interregnum could last very long. The interregnum could last indefinitely, in a sense. So what would that mean? That would mean that the European construction as such becomes increasingly ungovernable, and as a consequence also many of the component parts, I know that I'm very pessimistic, forgive me for that. That's my role. Become themselves ungovernable. They have increasing difficulties to form governments which are legitimate enough, and so on, and to take important decisions in either economic or diplomatic or other problems or issues. They become increasingly ungovernable, and the European Union as such, of course, or the group of countries, becomes increasingly unable to innovate and to act more or less consistently and in a common, with a common attitude on some global issues which are absolutely urgent and burning. I mention only one of them, of course, which is the climate change and ecological transformation problem. The fact is, and some of us are proud of that, that Europe took the initiative or had a relatively leading role a few years ago in asking the world, so to speak, to resolutely act in this respect. Many people think that it's in fact, in a sense, already very late, if not too late, but this doesn't mean that we should remain inactive. Very little is to be expected from the current and perhaps even for another American administration in this respect. Very little also from China. And other countries don't have the same weight, the same capacity to propose global regulation. So who, if not Europe? But if Europe is paralyzed by its own internal crisis, then nothing takes place. Now, the indefinite interregnum, of course, has models in past history which come to our minds repeatedly, and perhaps there are more, but this is a little bit of fun, perhaps, or funny comparison, but two of them come to my mind, of course. One is the Soviet system. This comparison is made frequently, which for years, in fact, if not decades, found itself before it finally collapsed, of course, in that situation. And the other one is the Holy German Empire, which, of course, has some also historical relations to the French situation. Now here, a few more minutes. Okay. I would gladly introduce what in Weberian terms, I love this expression, I would call eine Zwischenbetrachtung, an intermediary consideration. And this will be very short. This will be just to say that this is really the place to acknowledge the importance of a research like the one that Julien Klug has been proposing us yesterday, and more generally in his work, which is centered on the idea that politicization or depoliticization is a permanent dilemma. And of course, in critical situations, this dilemma becomes more urgent. So his axiom, of course, which I share, is that we need, and I think that my colleague will say more and better than me on that, a repoliticization. But what I would like to personally add to that is that I don't, and here, of course, my inspiration is slightly diverging from Julien's central reference to the Schmittian meaning of the term. I think that the issue of depoliticization is hardly separable from the issue of de-democratization. And that is, I would propose that the possibility of repoliticizing Europe is essentially linked to a progress or a radical initiative in the sense of re-democratizing and, in fact, democratizing a political construction which, in many important respects, did not mean to be democratic. And the reason why it didn't mean to be democratic was, of course, the idea, and here we come to the last point that I will mention today, the idea that the very place for the democratic legitimation of the European construction remained the nation state itself. And on this point, of course, I'm not on Schmidt's side, but I'm more on Habermas's side, even if I'm not totally convinced that the technical solutions he's proposing are sufficient to resolve the crisis or to offer a procedure for the resolution of the crisis. I nevertheless believe that he's moving in the right direction when he strongly argues, in particular, for the idea that representative democracy should decidedly emerge and become shaped at the European level. Of course, you will say there is a European Parliament, but as I was discussing privately, I hope it doesn't contradict me, yesterday with my colleague Hauke Bronkhorst, the paradox is the more powers the European Parliament acquires, the less initiative it is able to take, because in fact it essentially acts as a chamber of registration for decisions which are made elsewhere. And they are made, of course, in a technocratic manner, or even, perhaps this is the most important, when you take the case of the the European Central Bank, in a manner that is officially accepted from any democratic control. So, in this, my intuition or my proposal is that the future of representative democracy, which is very much at stake and contested in many political debates within each and every of our nation states. In France, in this moment, of course, we have an intense debate about this because the yellow vest movement that nobody really anticipated and that remains very difficult to politically identify from the point of view of its orientations, is putting a very strong accent not on the idea of representation but on the idea of participation or direct various forms of direct democracy. In my view, this does not cancel much less the importance of representative democracy, provided representative democracy does actually exist and becomes an important component of the political structure at every level where there is power. And of course, power is particularly there in the case of Europe at the supranational level. Final and last consideration, skipping many other things I had in mind. Should we return to the category of federation and use and defend the idea of a federal Europe? It is not popular in this moment, to say the least. I will I'm all the more inclined to defending the idea of the European federalism and presenting myself as a European federalist, provided with two provisos. The first is we must acknowledge that there are already federal elements which are very strong in the European construction as it exists today, but they are, in a sense, very perverse, or they produce very perverse effects, which is not to say that they can be pure and simply reversed. The perversity of the effects, of course, essentially comes from the fact I was just mentioning, that the most powerful federal or supranational elements are at the same time accepted and separated from any form, direct or indirect, of popular control, and therefore inevitably are perceived and present themselves as highly illegitimate or lacking the strong legitimacy that they would need, and therefore very easily, of course, also acting in an arbitrary manner. The consequence, nevertheless, of this kind of federalism from above and the deep transformations of the European societies themselves is the fact that the member states, this is not a federation. I used to call it a pseudo-federation. This is not a federation in the proper sense of the term. There's not enough equality, if you like, within it and transversality. But on the other hand, of course, the member states and their own citizens find themselves in a very strange situation. I absolutely don't believe, as some leftists in France say today, that the European construction today is just a confederation. It's based on treaties. So any state that is a member of the European Union could decide to withdraw, and as a consequence, it would return to some sort of independent and autonomous way of life. I mean, the very example of Britain in this moment is showing that this is not possible, and I think that we will see more. So the question is not whether we should accept or reject the kind of semi or pseudo-federalism that we have in Europe today. It is essentially a question of how we should transform it in order to invent a form of federation that never really existed in history, but perhaps is our common European task to find in the situation of today. And of course that leads to the question whether we can add federal elements which are not imposed from above or decided by treaties or enacted by central institutions, but which are also lateral or transversal, and that also come in a sense from below, which is a very enigmatic, of course, idea. As for the transversality, the example of universities that I was taking a moment ago is a good example, but of course it's limited and partial. It nevertheless has the importance of indicating that not everything should go through the member states or their government itself. The more there will be communications and common actions between European citizens across the borders, which are not decided or controlled or organized by the states themselves, the more these transversal elements will become significant. And of course, as for the idea that something should also come from below, the idea that I have in mind is that we terribly miss, that's a circle, because that's a vicious circle, political movements, including contesting and critical political movement that would be trans-European by nature, or that would not be grounded purely in their local territories. I know that there are huge difficulties for that. First of all, the difficulty of language, of course, which is not big difficulty for academics like you and me, because we speak English, but which is a terrible difficulty for workers or peasants or other categories of the population. So I don't underestimate that. And finally, the very last touch, sorry for the length and I stop, is I very strongly believe in the possibility for regions and especially perhaps cities in Europe to progressively create, I would say, a network and a web of civic activities and initiatives that compensate, so to speak, for the lack of popular presence and influence in the European Union itself. Sorry for the length, and thank you very much for your attention.